You are listening to I'll Follow You, a podcast about creative process and what really goes on behind the scenes of an artistic life. My name is Allison Felis, and I love talking to musicians, writers, visual artists, and other brilliant thinkers about their working methods, obsessions, and pet projects. Guess what? Just by tuning in, you're part of the inner circle now. Today on I'll Follow You, I am super excited to bring you my conversation with the author and editor Jerome Pohlen. Jerry has written 23 books for both adults and children, including Oddball, Illinois, which is the flagship title of the larger Oddball travel book series, The Apollo Missions for Kids, Albert Einstein and Relativity for Kids, Gay and Lesbian History for Kids, and Chicago Baby, as well as articles and op-eds for the Los Angeles Times, Advocate, and the Chicago Reader. Since 2001, he has worked for publishing company Chicago Review Press, where, as an acquisitions editor, he signs up adult nonfiction in categories including U.S. history, LGBTQIA, nature, popular science, and DIY, along with children's nonfiction and activity books. Prior to joining CRP, Jerry was the editorial director for the educational toy company Learning Resources. He taught 4th and 7th grade in the Chicago public school system, worked as an engineer for Martin Marietta, and served in the U.S. Peace Corps in Benin, West Africa. He graduated from the University of Notre Dame with a B.S. in mechanical engineering and received his master's in elementary education from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Our wide-ranging chat is roughly broken up into 3 distinct sections. We talk about his work as a writer, his father's work as an engineer on both the Apollo and Viking space missions, and Jerry's run for Congress as a Green Party candidate in Illinois in 2008. But since Jerry and I do know each other very well, after working together for about 20 years, I was also confident that there was no way this would turn into just a simple recitation of high points from his resume. There is lots of laughter as Jerry regales me with stories from his wild and wildly charmed life, including how he got the unofficial $100 tour of O.J. Simpson's house not long before it was torn down, the time when James Dean visited him in a dream to tell him to quit his job, how it took him probably 10 to 15 years to realize that he's always been a writer, and how spending time at an impressionable age around a bunch of scientists working on missions to Mars deeply imprinted on him the notion that problems are solvable. If you're looking for more information about any of the books he mentions here, please don't forget to check out the show notes on my blog, queenofpeaches.com, for links to those titles and lots of other explanatory tidbits. And now, my conversation with Jerome Pohlen. All right, Jerry Pohlen, this is your life, the joke that I had been making. Welcome. It's so good to have you here.
Oh, I always like spending time with you.
Oh, this is going to be awesome. Because again, like as we were coming up with like, oh, what kind of stuff do we want to talk about? It was just like, I just kept like, I didn't like even get to the bottom of all the interesting stuff that you do and have done. So I'm just excited to see where the conversation goes, because there's
Me
so
too. I
much...
never know myself.
Because there's just so much to talk about. So, I mean, let's start from the beginning of how we met, or I guess even the preface before that. So you're the author of the Oddball series that was published by Chicago Review Press. But before the Oddball books began, they were Cool Spots. So
that is correct.
Tell us about Cool Spots. Like, how did that start? Like, where did that idea come from? How long did you do them? How many of them did you do?
Well, okay. The basic thing is shortly after Jim and I started dating, I lived in Boys Town, and he lived at Irving Park in Southport, and there was a Cubs home game, and it was just crawling with fans, and it was just like, we got to get the hell out of town, So we got in his car. I had this book called Roadside America that is a wonderful book from the 90s. It has all kinds of goofy things, but it's really more of an armchair travel book. But we just like, let's just drive up to Wisconsin, maybe one of these places in here, but it's not written as a travel guide. It just says, there might be something in this town, or but it doesn't tell you where it's located or anything like that. So we were able to see a few things. We saw the Gold Pyramid House up in on the North Shore, and then we went up to the Johnson Wax building, the Frank Lloyd Wright building in Racine. And when we headed back, we found like this abortion memorial, all these crosses in this field. So Jim had some dry cleaning in the trunk, so we pulled out all the coat hangers and hung them on the fence in front of the thing, just causing trouble and staying away from Cubs fans. And we had so much fun. We thought, we got to do more trips like this, but this book is not very helpful. This is, it gives you some ideas, but, we spend a lot of time walking into gas stations like, can you tell me where the Gold Pyramid House is? And, so it was wasting a lot of time. And we thought, let's do more of these road trips. And I started just collecting information on an Excel spreadsheet. So this was just something to amuse ourselves. And we did another road trip down through Indiana because somebody was getting married that fall. And then a friend of ours, she had to go out of the country to she had to go out of the country to renew her visa. She was from Singapore, and we came up with this idea. And she had heard that if you went to El Paso and across to Juarez, they were really lax on renewing visas. And that we thought, well, let's just drive down to El Paso and we'll just see weird stuff along the way. And then we drove over to New Orleans and back up. And in 10 days, I think we put on about not quite 7,000 miles on the car. We were just driving. But we saw and by then I had a really large collection of weird things that I had researched. And, we went to a show of, what's her name? Anita Bryant, she, the rabidly anti-gay singer from the 70s, was in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. And she had this little theater and had a show there. And so we let's go see Anita Bryant, like the dumbest idea in the world for two gay men and their Singaporean friend. But we had a blast. And it turns out we talked to Anita Bryant after the show, and we had a mutual friend, and there's a whole weird story behind that whole thing. But we went to dinosaur parks, and we went to the grassy knoll in Dallas, and we went to, the Voodoo Museum in New Orleans, and just all kinds of things. And then we were hooked. So basically, anytime we had a 3-day weekend, we were off to go somewhere. And I think it was about maybe 8 months later or something like that, in the spring, they had the Gay and Lesbian March on Washington, and we went and did another trip. We went all through the South, and on that trip, we went to Paradise Gardens, Howard Finster's place in Georgia, which is, he's it's like the king of outsider art. He just several blocks worth of art in every corner imaginable, and in the trees and buildings and everything else like that. And then we got hooked on outsider art. So all through the 80s, through the 90s, we were traveling around and seeing things and collecting outsider and folk art and just amusing the hell out of ourselves. And the idea came to me because I'd followed zines and things like that. Like, I need to just write these up, and then I can write all these trips off on my taxes. Nice. So I started doing these zines, and I was having fun, and but I didn't have anywhere to sell them. So I went over to Quimby's, and I got up the courage to talk to the guy. This was when it was still over on Damon, the original guy that owned Steven Sabersky. And came up to the counter real sheepishly and like, I have this little zine, and could you possibly carry it? And he was so nice about it, and he gave me a little advice on how to improve it to make it more saleable. And they sold really well through there. And so I started sending them to, I don't know if you're familiar with Fact Sheet 5. Yeah, so I was sending them to Fact Sheet 5, and Fact Sheet 5 was reviewing them, and I was getting a lot of orders, and it was getting a lot of attention, but I really only was selling them through that place through Quimby's, and a place in San Francisco that a friend of mine knew. It was a travel bookstore, and he carried them as well. And so, I was just doing my thing, and one of these got into the hands of somebody who handed it to my boss at Chicago Review Press. And I was working another job. I worked at an educational toy company, and I got a call on on my answering machine that said, could you call us up? We've seen your cool spots. Where would you be interested in talking maybe about doing a real, full book? And at the time, I really wanted to do that, and I was even thinking of self-publishing a full, honest to God book as opposed to something that I stapled together on my coffee table at night. And called up and I said, yeah, sure. So I put together a quick proposal. They approved it. And and that became the first oddball in the series. And when the series started, I had to end Cool Spots so that I wasn't competing with myself. So I just sold all the extra stock to Quimby's, and that was sort of the end of Cool Spots as a zine. And then I started on Oddball. So
how many
started.
oddball or how many Cool Spots did you do before that happened? Like, did you sort of like release them all like over a series of months, or did you just kind of say, here you go, here's 50 states? Like,
I got up to, I was doing, probably one every month or two. And the one thing is I wasn't traveling to every spot. Some of it was just like, so-and-so was murdered in this town. I did the research, but this was like before the internet, before you could really do interest. And I didn't have the money to go travel around and do this. So, they were not entirely accurate. Sometimes certain things had closed or whatever, but when I started doing Oddball, I went to every site, so I wanted to make sure that I did that right. So what was your question, though? Oh, I did about 40. I did about 40 states.
Wow. 40 states. Nice.
Yeah.
That's really impressive. All on your own.
Yeah, and I've been collecting stuff for all the others, too. I mean, I had stuff for California, but I never did a California book. So I still had the ability. And I traveled a lot for my old job. So sometimes I would take an extra few days, and I'm in San Diego, like, I got to go down to Tijuana and see what's there. And I got to go to the Death Museum and the Gaslight Quarter. And I got to go to this roller coaster. And, so I would just use that to piggyback and on the travel to see other things. And that's how I collected information and stories and stuff like that. Yeah.
And so, I mean, you said that like you and Jim, that was like how it started, was just like taking road trips and getting out of town and seeing weird stuff. But like that is also just kind of like your personality is that you like weird shit, So it's like I don't know what my question is about this, but just like in terms of, is that something that you would have been doing obviously it's something that you would have been doing anyway, but just like the ethos of kind of like, oh yeah, we're gonna lean into like this weird stuff. It's like, was that like part of when you were making the zines? Did you lean into that weirdness, or was it just kind of like, this is what I'm interested in and everyone else can like screw off,
Yeah, the cool spots were less correct in they were like it's real inappropriate stuff. I mean, telling people where to go to see where a serial killer lived and stuff like that. That's not, but we always had great stories for parties, like we talked our way into OJ's house, and when we went to Los Angeles, and
how did you talk yourself into? I feel like I've heard this story, but you have to tell it. Like I don't remember like all the scoop on this.
Well, it was one of those things that Jim came out and visited. I was at a conference in Las Vegas. He came out and visited me. We drove down to LA and just went to all the weird stuff. And of course, OJ, he had already lost the civil trial, and they were going to tear down that house. I didn't find this out till later. And the proceeds was going to go to the Goldman family. And but we wanted to go by and see all the sites. And it's always sort of interesting to see these things like, oh, so this is what it, this event that happened. I can better understand it now that I see sort of the lay of the land and the neighbors and the, where we're at and how close we are to Hollywood and, where he lived in Brentwood. And, it's an educational experience, and it's always fun because you find something. And of course, it was really obvious which was OJ's house because they had a big storm fence, or that temporary storm fence that they had put up. But there was a recycling thing out, and Jim's like, let's go see if he's got any like magazines with his name on it. Let's go get those. And it was sitting right outside the gate. And so we, parked the car somewhere, and we went back, and we're just like walking around looking at things. And and there wasn't anything in the recycling that was other than, juice bottles and things like that. But but this head popped up over the fence, and he's like, "Ooh, tourists," he said. And so I and Jim went running. He thought it was OJ was coming after him. And it turns out it was like some out of work actor who was guarding the house, or just, kind of like paid to walk around there. And he opened the gate, and he's like, "You want the $100 tour?" And I just gotten out $100 from a cash machine for other reasons, and I'm like, "This is a sign. We've got to do that." So I took out the money. He's like, "Not here, not here. You got to wait till you're inside." So he brought us in the gate, and I paid him $100, and then we walked through the house, and we saw where the Heisman Trophy case is, and where Cato was, and the place was empty at the time. And this guy was a real weirdo too. He's like, he brought us into the walk-in closet, and he's like, "This is where OJ got up in the morning and shouted, 'I'm the juice, I'm the juice.'" And he's jumping around and getting into his method acting, and we're like, "I'm going to remember this." And so it's so many stories like that. I'm not too many serial killers killers at their house, but they tore down the house, I think, about a few months later. So
well, well worth the $100 to have been in there before they tore it down. Yeah.
I've written about that. I think I did a WBZ piece on that, so it paid off in the long run.
Well, okay, so I want to talk more about how you then parlayed this into the Oddball series, but let's go ahead and follow that thread to WBEZ, because when did you start doing your radio spots? Because that was something you were doing a lot for a while.
Yeah, it was about the time that I started Chicago Review Press. The book came out, and I was getting a lot of radio interviews, and one of them was with Jennifer Fields from WBEZ, and she wanted to do like a longer piece, and so we met at what was it called? The Blue Heron, Blue Frog, something like that. It's near where our offices is, but it was a bar that had games, and so we wanted to meet at some place that was a little goofy. It was in my book. You could play the Game of Life or Monopoly or Kerplunk at the tables while you were drinking and eating at this bar. And so we had this, we played a game of Sorry while she interviewed me, and then we sort of mixed it all together, and it was a real hoot. We had such a great time, and she brought it back to her producers there and said, we should do a regular thing with him. And so, we talked about it, and then I started writing little his history pieces about weird things that happened in Chicago, like the Eastland disaster and stuff like that. And then it sort of morphed into, well, Jennifer is coming along on these road trips. So it was Jim and Jennifer and I driving around to these weird places. We'd show up. She would just have her microphone and follow us around, and I would talk to people, and then she would go back and produce them into pieces. So we ended up doing about 60 of those, I think, over the next 3 years or so. And that was fun, while it lasted. And, it was something that I didn't expect to be doing, but it sort of piggybacked nicely on the Oddball books. And I was always I resurrected the name Cool Spots with that one by calling,
nice.
From a cool spot in, Akron, Ohio, this is Jerry Pohlen, that kind of thing.
Oh, awesome.
But it was great because, that was actually weirder than I think the Oddball sometimes are. The Oddball, sometimes it's history, it's strange history, but it's not just like wacky, weird kind of material. But
and this is another theme of, I feel like, sort of all the things that you do is that you do just kind of get invited and asked to do crazy stuff, because like you said, you had another job, and then you were making these Cool Spots, and then Chicago Review Press came calling and said, "Hey, we want to publish your book." And then how did you end up then working for CRP? How did that all come together?
Well, the job that I worked for, I was ready to move on, and when the phone call came, I'd been working there, but maybe 7 years, and I thought, well, maybe this is it, but we'll have to see. And they turned it in, and when sold like gangbusters right out. I think they sold 5,000 copies in the first few months,
Awesome.
which is unheard of, but it was just an explosion. And it was like in the spring, and I knew that I thought it would do it. And I started writing a Wisconsin book as a follow-up. And I thought, once I get the sale on that, I'll just pitch him the idea of the Wisconsin thing. And when it did well out of the gate, I talked to my boss, my current boss, and my editor, and I said, well, I've got a Wisconsin book. Would you be interested? And I already had the proposal and everything. and so I sent it right over, and then we got it signed up within a few weeks. And so I started working on the Wisconsin one. And then the Illinois book just kept getting more and more sales and everything else like that. And they really wanted to get the Wisconsin one out. And so by the end of summer, after I turned that one in, it's like, would you be interested in one on Indiana? And so I started really working on that. And this is going to sound crazy, but at my job, I wanted to sort of keep them separate. So sometimes at lunch, I would go and park in a parking lot across the street from where I worked, and do research, reading about James Dean. This was Indiana, of course. And I was reading just sort of, a lot of background on James Dean, and it was a fall day and the window was down, and I was like, I just got to close my eyes and just relax a little bit. And so I was taking a little lunchtime nap, and when I sat up at the end of it, I heard James Dean's voice say, "Quit your job." I swear to God, and I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in anything. It was some kind of psychological thing, but I definitely heard it in my brain. I'm like, yeah, I'll quit my job and I'll just be a full-time writer, and, and so I mentioned, just like in passing, when I was talking to my editor at Chicago Review Press, I said, I'm thinking on leaving my job and maybe just doing this full-time. And, she's a very realistic person. She's like, I don't know if you're necessarily going to be making enough to support a full-time job, but we've got an opening here that we're going to have next year. Would you like to come in and talk to us about that? So I went in and I ended up interviewing for the job of the woman who was the editor on my books, as just a production editor. And I said, I can't leave before the end of the year because I got an end of the year bonus, but yeah, I'll come work here. So And what was great is they always understood when I needed to take time and go away to do the research, because they were getting the book that I got from doing it. So and it was just another case. I've never done a job search in my life. They always sort of like popped in, and I always said, well, this is an opportunity. I'm going to take it and see where it goes. And, that's how I got the book contract. That's how I got the radio contract. That's how I got my current job. It's just always been weird that way,
So okay. So with that being said, like, rewind us back to like what your actual training is in, because you're an engineer. Like, it wasn't like because these days, I always laugh about how, like, yeah, if you want to be an author, everyone's like, go to school and being an English major and go to the publishing institute and whatever. And like you are the furthest thing from that, right?
Yeah. No, my undergraduate's in mechanical engineering, and I did that because my father was an engineer and he always seemed to be having so much fun. And I'm like, oh, that sounds like a fun profession. And I'm good at math and science. I could do that, And so I just sort of like blindly stumbled through college and ended up with a mechanical engineering degree with a solid B- average. And but I didn't know if I wanted to be an engineer. So I joined the Peace Corps for a couple of years, and I came back and I worked as an engineer for a couple of years. And I realized it ain't as fun as it was when my dad was first getting started. Yeah. And I thought, I got to change. So and at the time I was, beginning the mental process of coming out, and I thought, I need to get away. I need to go someplace new. So I came to Chicago with almost no money, and I was going to go to grad school to become a teacher. And I eventually got a master's in education, and I taught in the Chicago public schools for a year. And came out, and the nice thing about being gay is, like, there's fewer expectations about how you're supposed to behave and what you're supposed to do. At least it was at the time, and because people I don't know, particularly in the 80s, in the early 90s, it was sort of like, I don't know why Jerry's going on these road trips. That must be a gay thing, So I I could get away with any kind of strange behavior, and my parents were always just fine with me being weird, and I think they actually got a kick out of it, particularly my dad. And they like to hear the stories too, and I wasn't hurting anybody, and they liked Jim, and so the 90s was just a very, very weird time of road trips and entertaining myself living in Chicago, and then I eventually kind of stumbled through. I taught for a while in the schools, and I got a call completely out of the blue from an old professor of mine that said, we're developing math materials with a National Science Foundation grant here at the university where I had just graduated. We need a writer. Would you be willing to come and write math quizzes for me? So I went, and after the end of the school year, I started back at University of Illinois Chicago writing math quizzes for a program called Maneuvers with Mathematics, and I did that for 2 years until the contract ran out. And one of the people that I worked with had gone to work at Learning Resources, where I eventually went to work, the toy company. And they needed a science editor. And she's like, oh, I know somebody. So they called me up, and I went over there, and I started, a few weeks after I went talked to them. And, another job that I kind of like stumbled into, and I was a science editor for a while, and then they needed an editorial director. So that's the job that I had for most of the time I was there. So I was managing people and projects that the company published. So
with the writing bit, I mean, was that something that you had pre-existing interest in? I mean, because you said that, you got into the engineering stuff because of your dad, but like, did you always like to write? I mean, or was that sort of like a new thing? Like, sure, I'll try this out too.
You know what? I like to write, but I think it was my love of books. I just loved books. When I was a kid, I thought it was a loophole, but my parents said, the Scholastic Book Fair, you can have as many books as you want, but you got to read them all, and they would check on you. And I thought, and my parents were not extravagant as far as like giving us gifts and toys and stuff like that. But I thought of this as a real loophole, like as many books as I want, And I had like terrible bad hay fever. We lived out in the country, and it's like summers are reading books. And, I'd love to read. So I just had this love of reading and stories and books. And I think I developed this love of story and storytelling. And that was where my writing came from. When I was in the Peace Corps, they had a newsletter, and they were always asking people to contribute things. So I would do a story each time, and it was just mostly to amuse myself and the fact that I had a lot of free time to do such things. And then when I was working as a engineer, I was taking classes in fiction writing and screenwriting, just to take a class, just to get some feedback,
Yeah.
And I had this great professor in my fiction writing class, and he would we would be writing a story a week. They were very short, and then on the beginning of each new cycle of writing for a week, he would read what he thought were some of the better stories that came in, 2 or 3, and he read every single one of mine to the class, and he wouldn't identify who it was, but he would just read it. And it was such a boost to my confidence that I at least knew how to tell a story and get laughs, because I was sitting in the class. They didn't know it was I was the one that wrote the thing, and they were laughing at these things. And I'm like, oh, you know what? I can actually do this. And so writing always did, from then on was always something that I enjoyed doing just to amuse myself, but I wasn't like making any money on zines or anything like that. Oh yeah, we sold all of 100 of my bestseller,
so at probably $4 a pop, right, at the time.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. but I've always liked to bullshit with people and tell stories, and this is just sort of like a function of that. And it's only later that I really grew to appreciate the art of writing as I became an editor. And I think my writing has improved over the years, but I'm probably taking fewer chances than I used to. But everything's a trade-off, but that's sort of how it all got started. But and I didn't realize it, but I had been doing a lot of writing even through elementary school and high school. My mom showed me this it was like a little newspaper that was done by the Sedalia Elementary School, and she showed it to me, and they were all like little reports, like, oh, we're having a bake sale or whatever. And right in the middle of there was about a 3-paragraph story that I had written about a dog. And
Oh,
I think it was like my first story. It was like just, and I'm like, oh, I guess maybe I did want to be a writer, and I just didn't realize it until I was well into my late 20s, and started doing the zine. Like the forces of the universe sort of pushed me in this direction of my interests, and I was fortunate enough that these opportunities presented themselves, and that's how it all happened.
well, and because that was, full disclosure, we worked together for a really long time, but that was like that was always such a unique gift that you had, was that you had the math and the science and the engineering background, but also were this incredibly lucid writer, that you were able to combine both of them. So I feel like that had to have been a boon too, like through the years, and being able to like speak to like both sides of sort of like the math science / liberal arts kind of divide, is that you can go between them a little bit more fluidly than I think most writers, who again come out of sort of like a straightforward liberal arts education can.
Yeah, and you know what, and my engineering background, it still bleeds through in sort of like the way I approach a lot of stuff. It's like I've got spreadsheets, like what, of how I want it to lay out, or like when I do oddballs, there are only like 2 or 3 paragraphs for each entry that are in there. And so I had like a checklist. It's like, I got to do at least 2 every night to get this accomplished. I plotted out the number of days, and it's like, if it's due in May, then I have to be at this point at this time. And I didn't spend a lot of time I spent less time thinking about the writing than keeping on track,
Right.
which was like a very engineering sort of approach to it, all. And between you and me, it's like I can't spell for shit. I'm just a terrible speller. And grammar, it's not something that I ever really studied. I know that you had we always laughed about it, the grammar rodeo, when you get together with some of the writer types at work, and talk about this. Like, I wouldn't know the participle if it walked in the door right in there. I just don't have that background, but I do have like sort of a lot of background in just like listening to stories and writing stories and telling stories. And so that, I think my tone in a lot of the stuff is very conversational. And, that's sort of the style that I developed, at least for the oddball stuff.
Yeah, I mean, because you're very, like I said, a very lucid writer, which I feel like also allows the humor to come through, because you're so funny. I mean, it's like you've been very funny in this past 20 minutes already, but like you're able to write funny too, which I feel like is rare for some people too. Like the oddball books, it's like, everyone please go out and read them, because they are very, very, very funny as well. So is that something that you like tried to cultivate after a certain point, or was it just really an extension of your own like inherent sensibility?
Well, at least as far as the oddball were concerned, I was just sitting on piles and piles of research and information that I'd been collecting. And it's like, you want a book on Rhode Island? I got plenty of material that I could get. I could do this, and I knew how to fill in all the other things. So the oddball books were very different, because they were sort of driven by just some real economic things, like where do we think we would sell them best, and which states are underserved with travel guides. So it was like a real kind of like businessy decision. And I'd say, I can write about weird things in Indiana, or I can write about weird things in Florida, or wherever you want. You just tell me where it is. So that was one thing. But then I think over time I started wondering, can I even really write anything that's longer than 2 or 3 paragraphs, on a particular subject? Can I tell a real story from beginning to end and make it work? I was editing other people's work, and by this time I was working, as an editor at Chicago Review Press, and I had been trying to pitch this idea of a book on Albert Einstein for a series that was part of Chicago Review Press, and I pitched it out to a number of people, and they thought about it and like, oh, I don't even know anything about relativity or whatever. And I'm like, why in the world wouldn't I do this? I'll give it a shot. I've edited at that point probably 6 or 7 of books in that particular series. And I said, I know the format, I know what's needed. I know the length, the how to write to this audience or getting somebody else so that their book is appropriate for that audience. And so I talked to my boss and I said, would you be interested in me considering writing a book on Einstein and relativity? And she said, sure. So I put together a proposal. It was, everybody said go. And so I started that, and it was a real new step for me in writing. And I've done 3 of those 4 kids books now. And I've enjoyed them more than any, even though I like the subject and it's closer to my life, the oddball stuff. Writing a story with beginning, a middle, and an end, and themes, and everything that goes into that, I just really love it. Not for the entire length of the time writing it, but I mean, it's just such a wonderful experience to just like learning about a subject to the detail that you need to tell a real good story. And I think I did a really good job with Einstein, and I did a couple books after that, and I hope to do more if it presents itself. So
because Einstein and relativity for kids, right, is the name.
Correct. Yeah, for like a middle grade audience. But
I'll put the link in the description in the show notes and everything if everyone wants to go buy a copy. We'll sell it before you here. Yeah.
and I liked it because I learned so much in the whole process. And this is going to sound silly, but I think by the end of it, it's like I sort of considered Einstein a friend. I knew him very well from all of the research that I had done, and I'd visited places where he lived, and really delved into relativity and how I would explain to a young kid, like a junior, late elementary or junior high level kid, and I think I did a pretty good job, and it really kind of boosted my confidence as a writer, having been at it for like 15 years at that point, and so that's why I took on other topics that were of interest to me. My next book on that series was Gay and Lesbian History for Kids, which was just really wonderful to write. And then I did a book on for the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, that Apollo missions for kids, and that was close to my heart because my dad had worked in the space program when I was a kid, and so it was, and he'd actually even worked on the Apollo program for a while, and it was just again, I like the long form better than I like the short form, even though we're still doing oddball trips but nobody buys travel books anymore, so that series is dead just by the marketplace. Everybody's got their phones, and so they don't need a travel book anymore. So
well, I was just gonna say, like, as you were describing, going on the road trips with Jennifer and doing the cool spots for WBEZ, it seems like that would be like a natural thing now. Like, it almost probably would have been bigger if you would like parlay that into like a little YouTube series or like a little sort of like Instagram series or something. So I don't know, there's a way to tech it up and sort of represent that stuff, outside of radio, where you can actually like, show images of where you are. So maybe that's the next step, Jerry.
Well, I've recently reconnected with her. We ran into her up in Wisconsin at an event, and she does a podcast as well. So maybe, cool. I don't know, maybe we'll redo that.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to see you guys like tromping around like through the cow patties and stuff. And
she was such a wonderful like addition to, I mean, she could keep up with us, and she was funnier than even we were. So we really had a great time working on those things. But
so how many books have you written, like, total? Because you just keep writing.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I actually wrote science kits for a while. I actually wrote them for the company that I used to work for. So I did like 12 of those, and all. I look at it as projects because they've been science kits, they've been books, and I've even done baby board books, like little small ones. But I think I'm up to like 51 right now.
Wow.
So yeah,
That is
but
severely impressive. That is incredibly impressive.
but 20 of them are, like one sentence on a spread, so
It still counts. It's still
it still
writing.
counts.
It still
Yes,
has an
exactly.
ISBN on it. Like
Right.
so like as an editor, I mean, so like you were saying, having been editing other people's material, that like finally gave you the confidence to do of this more long form stuff. I mean, how do those inform each other? Like as, editing and writing, and how do you feel like those disciplines overlap for you?
To be honest, it was sort of tough being, and it still is, sort of being a writer and an editor, in the sense that I get, I've been working on books for, like other science books in that series that was with Einstein, for example. And I'm reading through it and I'm thinking, I would have done this different. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that, I'm reading it and I'm thinking, oh, I think if I would have done this, I would have done it this way. But I don't want that. I came to the realization is like, it's not about what I thought, how I think it should have been done. They are their own writer and I want their voice to come out. So I wanted to respect. So I think I'm probably a really light-handed editor, because I never really appreciated people like mucking around too much with my idea of writing a book, that they had to have good reasons for making suggestions and changes, and not, and I had even more ideas because I'm thinking of it from a writer's point of view. But, it took a while to sort of like work that out with editing, only because this other voice in my head was, coming out and saying, boy, if you'd written that book about this subject, you would have done it differently. But, here's another activity. I have suggested activities, because that was always sort of, these books have 21 activities in them, and that's always been the struggling point. And because I used to be a teacher and I wrote math materials and science materials, I'm like, I'll give you some experiments, try, have them do this, have them do that. I had no problem, because they were always real accepting of suggestions. But when it came to the actual story that ran through there, I've always wanted the authors to have their voice, as long as it wasn't crazy or didn't make sense, or, was inaccurate, or left some big aspect of their life out or something. So.
Well, because then at a certain point, like you started at Chicago Review Press as a project editor, and at a certain point you got into acquisitions too, so again, another one of those opportunities that just kind of presented itself. And how is that for you, just as far as like identifying trends and identifying sort of, like you said, like what's saleable, and working with authors sort of on that very, very front end?
I'd like to think that I have a firm grasp on the market, and know kind of like where publishing is going. But if I'm honest, I was like, a lot of these things is sort of like, that's an interesting book that I would pick up on a table at a bookstore.
Yeah.
And it isn't necessarily that the logic says. I mean, we did a book, just as an example, we did a book on it was a memoir by the daughter of Don Knotts. And I saw that and I'm like, I know there are a lot of affectionate fans of Don Knotts who would love this book. Not because I saw it as a trend in the bookstore or anything else like that. I just knew the Andy Griffith Show is on nonstop on cable TV. They've got conferences not conferences. They have events in North Carolina every year where people come back and to Andy Griffith's hometown, and thousands and thousands of people do that every year. And I'm thinking, there's an audience for that book here. So I think when I do acquisitions, I think of sort of like audiences as opposed to publishing trends.
Yeah. No, that's well said. That's interesting. That's a cool way to think of it.
Yeah. And also I think too, in acquisitions, I always try to do like what I call like dual audiences. There is an audience for the Don Knotts one for people who just like a memoir by a daughter, and the the father-daughter relationship that's in there.
Right.
Or, a lot of these books that I've signed up, they have that dual or triple possibility as far as who that you could probably sell that to. And I
Right.
figured the more audiences you have without diluting it too much, the better they'll probably do.
Yeah.
And then there's just like you just see this charming proposal. I mean, the one, Grandma Gatewood's Walk, about the
Oh, yeah.
excuse me, the first woman to walk the entire length of the Appalachian Trail in 1 year, and she just happened to be
Amazing story.
Yes, and she was 61 at the time, and then she turned around and did it again, and then she did it again, and then she walked the Oregon Trail, and she did it with like no gear, no planning. She didn't even tell her family. She just went there with her, she got a nice new pair of Keds and a plastic bag for a poncho, and then 2,000 miles later she's in Maine. And it's like, how could I not suggest that we publish a book like that? It's like there's it's got adventure, it's got this feisty old lady who's battling the weather, and if it appeals to me, and I'm a big book buyer and book lover, I like to think that there are other people that have similar interests, or I've got like some sense of what's a book that somebody would pick up, because I picked up a lot of books.
Yeah, because you've like really, again, you're not acquiring for trends, but your sensibility has allowed you to identify stuff like, yeah, the Grandma Greatwood's Walk, and then also the Mini Weapons of Mass Destruction series was hugely successful. I mean, it sounds so goofy, to try to describe it, but it was like people loved those. They sold really well.
Yeah, and that was a case of like, it went right back to my childhood. I had two real good friends in elementary school, and we formed the Troublemakers Club, and we had like pea shooters, and we would like just do all kinds of just like low grade troublemaking, and we would we got in trouble a lot, but one of the things is we had these little pea shooters that you made out of clothespins, and it was in a design that we perfected and improved, and then when this book came in, and it was similar, it was using office products and binder clips and pencils and stuff like that to make shooters or rubber band rockets, and right up my alley as far as a nerdy little kid. And it's like, I would have loved this when I was a kid, and I figured other people would too. And that book was, well, you were buying it, to be printed every few months.
Oh my gosh. And just thousands and thousands and thousands of copies at a pop. Yeah. It sold really, really well.
Yeah. So I in some ways do that same approach to my own career. It's just like I look for something that kind of passes my view, and if it looks like it's inviting and interesting and fun, that's the one I want to work on. And it's served me well over the years.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, no, I love that it's not calculated, that it is just like, because you have such a breadth of knowledge that you're able to say like, oh, well, if this is interesting to me, chances are it's going to be interesting to other people. So I love the humanity and the human aspect of that, where it really is. Yeah, it's not trying to like predict something, out in the world. It's saying like, no, there's a warmth here. There's something warm here that people are going to respond to.
Yeah.
Well, so all right. So again, weird things that come your way, and I mean, again, this isn't weird, but incredibly cool that you were born into this space family. Like, talk about your dad and as an engineer and working for
I was
space programs.
When I was born in late '63, my family was living in Southern California, and my dad was working on the Apollo program, and he was North American Rockwell was North American at the time. They combined with Rockwell, and he worked there on it was the capsule. He focused if you've ever seen the Apollo capsule splash down, and it's got these Mickey Mouse ears, that inflate on the top of it to keep it from capsizing. The shape of a capsule, which is sort of like a real low cone, if it splashes down in the ocean, it's got two ways that it can float. It can float right side up, or it can float upside down. And it was just the luck of a draw on how it hit the water, how it floated. So they needed some way to flip it back over if it was upside down. And what you do is you inflate these Mickey Mouse ears at the top of this cone. And if it was upside down, it would flip over, and then they could get the astronauts out. So he was working on a very specialized, part of the program to build these balloon ears, for lack of a better term, the uprighting floats. And of course, I didn't know anything about this because I was a little kid and I was just born. And I don't know exactly how it happened, but my dad took a job working for Martin Marietta in Denver because they would begin talk about a trip, of unmanned mission to Mars, the Viking mission. And I think he wanted to sort of get in on the ground floor of that. So the family moved from California to Colorado when I was only just 2 years old. So growing up, I didn't really know anything about his work on the Apollo program. But we lived and breathed the Viking program when we were kids. And much to my parents' credit, they brought us along on every stage of the journey as far as explaining it. All my dad's friends, engineers that he worked with, were always by the house. It had sort of a little bit of a Mad Men kind of thing. It was like like a late 60s, early 70s kind of like drinking and having fun kind of crowd. And but anyway, he worked on the lander that went to Mars, the very first lander that went to Mars. And in 1975, when it launched, the family went down for the summer to Kennedy Space Center for the launches. And so we spent that summer down there, and we got these backstage tours and backstage. We got like a special tour, and we got to crawl through the old Apollo simulators. I got pictures of me and my brothers, flipping all the switches and stuff like that. So it makes a big impression on you and a kid to be sort of like seeing all this cool stuff. And then near the end of the summer, I think it was in August, they had been delayed because of weather and because of the typical glitches when a rocket launches. We only got to see one of the two launches. There were two landers that went, but we did get to see the one, and it was just if you never, anybody listening to this, if you've never seen a rocket launch, you really should go and see it. It's sort of like the difference between watching the eclipse on TV and seeing, actually being there when the lights go out when there's an eclipse, which I did a couple years ago, like a lot of people did. And it was just something that's so very weird and unique. And when, we watched this thing that my father had worked on for all these years, that we had been, we were, and seeing this flash of light in the distance when it ignites. And I remember my dad saying it blew up because we couldn't see the rocket coming. Oh. We couldn't even hear it at that point because it was so far away. But as I think I told you, you can see the sound wave coming towards you, not because you see the sound wave, but because you see all the birds taking off. So It's like this, you can just see like all these birds coming up, and then of course the sound hits you, and it just like rattles out your fillings. It's just a very powerful. And going to Mars, you had to have this very popular, very strong Titan rocket that did it. And just watching this go, and where everybody's screaming, and the noise and the birds and everything else like that, again, it makes a big impression on you. And then they landed it in July of 76. They were going to actually land it on the bicentennial, but then they had second thoughts about that after they got some new photographs, and they're like, we probably shouldn't take this $1 billion program and crash this lander on the nation's bicentennial. So they delayed it until the 20th of July of 76. And when and after it landed, the images that were being sent back was, it was just one line of pixels at a time, and it was like sweeping across the page. And so the first thing you see is just like some sand with a few little rocks on it, and then it's going and it's going. And this is, like watching paint dry, but for us it was like the most thrilling thing. And then what they wanted to do is they took a picture of the ground right next to the footpad of the lander to see how far the lander had landed and whether the lander was upright. So there was a reason why the very first image of the Viking landing, or very first image from the surface of Mars, is of the landing pad of the Viking thing. That just happened to be the part of that program that my dad worked on. So we had he had scratches and his father's initials on the bottom of the landing pad, so that when it landed on Mars, it would be, on Mars. And yeah. And so, growing up with this, I think it gave me a certain level of confidence that problems are solvable. Nobody had ever landed on Mars before. And my dad and his friends and everybody that worked on the program figured out, how do you land a spacecraft on Mars? And then they go and did it, and they only, they did it using punch cards, not like, the big computers. And I think for me, it sort of showed me that big problems or big challenges can be addressed and can be accomplished, and it sort of set my worldview, and I think the worldview of my brothers, that you can do it, you can do things that you never have imagined that you could do. And anyway, so that's my little spiel about
I love that. I mean, I love that that's what you took away from it, was the hard work. It wasn't, you didn't take away the glamour of it. You didn't take away any, American jingoism or anything like that. You took away, like, let's solve a problem and let's figure out how to do it. Like, that's so beautiful.
Yeah. And that's what I love so much about writing the book about the Apollo program. It's such a positive, it was such a positive program overall for the country. It's like people were behind it. It seemed sort of interesting and fun and spooky in a way. But by and large, people were, like all on board with it. And it was so, of course, Donald Trump was elected in 2016. My father died about a month later, and it was just like real low spot. And I had already been signed up to do the Apollo program. And it really helped me get over both of those, because I could focus on a time when the government actually sort of successfully accomplished something that they set out to do. And people were by and large not like sniping at each other and whatever. So it was a nice retreat for me to be working on that project, as we were going through some really dark times in our country. And then
I guess I had forgotten that that's when you were working on that book, but that's how amazing that was the thing that got you through that. That's really cool.
Yeah. It was really weird. I tell this is another one of those, like, I'm not a believer. I'm not, I'm a real cynic about a lot of things. But when we had a memorial for my father the following spring, and my mom had pulled some stuff out to just put on the table, pictures and things that he had worked on. And one of the things she pulled out was this. It was like a cheat sheet booklet about the Apollo program that had things like just basic weights of different parts of the, it was just something that everybody apparently at North American had a copy of. And it had, just like the basics, so that things that were being done at other companies, the other companies sort of like knew the specs, when they wanted to work something out on paper, like, oh, okay, we need a parachute to slow down this, whatever, this, this is how much the boosters now weigh, or, just all kinds of stuff like that. But it was a really cool book. And I was the kid that, like, I went through the attic, or not that we went through like a storage unit, went through all my parents' old stuff. I was like the snoop, like, you're always digging through your parents' stuff. I had never seen this thing in all my years. And I think I knew everything that was in their basement. And somehow this thing was hidden all these years. And the fact that it appeared, I when I got the book signed up, Dad was really thrilled that I was going to be writing it. I was going to have him help me, read through it, and give me some of his insights, having worked on the program. And then he died, and I thought, oh, geez, and I got to go on with when this booklet showed up out of the blue that I'd never seen before, I was just like, oh, this is really kind of weird. And I used a number of images from that in the book, but I don't know how I got on that, but
no, that's so special. I mean, again, this again, Jerry Pohlen, this is your life, your charmed life of just things working out.
Yeah. And it was really nice too that Chicago Reader Press has always been very nice to me as far as like indulging some of my little quirks and the things that I want to do. And this book was a real labor of love, and it sold actually pretty well as well. So that was, that's part of the goal. But, I found this picture of our family when we were back in 1969. We went down to Guaymas, New Mexico. We went down to Mexico quite often, and we had driven down, and I didn't remember any of this, but we had stopped at this, large satellite dish receiving station in Guaymas, Mexico, that was specifically for the Apollo. And there's a picture of me and my two brothers, and we're all, we would have been 4, 5, and 6 maybe at the time, standing next to this enormous satellite receiving station with my grandma in her big floppy hat. And I'm like, and it said on the sign behind us, this radar facility is used for tracking the Apollo program, over our shoulder. And I'm like, could we possibly just throw this in the book somewhere? So it's like stuck in the back matter of the book, but at least got it in there. And
yeah,
they were very nice to let me get my own face in the in the book, even though it was, when I was 4. Publishing for a publishing house, they're there to make money. I can't say that I really made my, if I was to figure out how much time I invested in all of these things, I didn't, I probably lost money on every single project that I worked on, but I had a great time, and I came out with something that I thought was really interesting. And I don't know what my point is. Oh, that internal passion about the subject matter, I think, is what drives you. And it's not that you're going to have a bestseller. I mean, I always tell authors, you got to figure out what you want out of this. If you think you're going to retire based on the sales, you don't have a very realistic, I don't say it that way, but I mean, not very few authors, as you know, live on just being an author. But there are so many things you get out of it. You get to meet interesting people. I mean, working on the Apollo program, I went down to the Space Fest, and I met a lot of the old astronauts, and it was just such a wonderful time to talk about my father and working on the program, and the very short time that we had, and drinking with one of the it just so happened that Cunningham, I forget what his first name is. He recently passed away. He was on one of the early flights that didn't go all the way to the moon, but he just pulled up a chair with his wife at a table, and we were sitting around waiting for some events to start, like the banquet at the end of the thing. And we had a nice talk, about all kinds of things. And it's like, I can't believe I get to sit and talk to an astronaut just because I'm writing this kid's book. That's worth to me more than, I had to pay for
to be there. Yeah.
But I would say that to any author. It's like, think about all the things you're going to be getting out of it that are beyond just like fame and fortune, because those aren't as those are a little more fleeting than the fact that you get to go through this process of creating something that what would you? I always tell people it's like a term paper that everybody gets to read.
I love that. But again, that seems, like you were saying about, watching, your dad and his colleagues, that it seems like a similar lesson that you learned, as far as like, let's do this and have fun, because it's like, we may never see the end of this. I mean, there was, I'm sure that there was like research that they were doing that, was for future missions that they were never going to be involved with, and so having that sense of it's bigger than me, right? Like,
and even like behind that, it's like the day that the Viking landed on Mars, everybody that worked on the program lost their job. The contract only went through the day. So as they're watching these pixels appear, and they have the biggest accomplishment in their life appearing right before their line, they're getting a pink slip.
Oh my God, that sucks. That's so awful. Like I well, I mean, so that like that awful mercenary quality that like leads us very neatly into your run for Congress, because it seems like there's a certain cynicism to the politics of a government program that would cut all the scientists the minute that the program ended, and what could be more cynical than running for office? So tell me about how that all happened.
That was just another like weird twist, but basically I was not a big fan of the Iraq War, and I was involved in a lot of the protests, and I was involved with the local peace group, and we would go out and stand on street corners with signs, and
you took me to one downtown. Like, it was one of the first protests I'd ever been to.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. Yeah, George Bush was at the Hilton.
Yeah.
Screaming at him, and it's real cathartic, like if you're not happy about things, you go out there and scream at the president. That's worthwhile.
I remember it was really, really cold too, but like I couldn't even tell, because I was like, when's he gonna drive by? Like,
and of course, like they're zipping by so fast, like it's that one over there, yeah, fuck you. But so I had been involved in the anti-war thing, and then this weird thing happened in Illinois where there was a Green Party candidate that ran for governor. I think it was like Blagojevich's first election or whatever. But the rule in Illinois was if a statewide candidate got more than 10% of the vote in a statewide race, and I think he got 11 or 12%, his name was Rich Whitney, then you've got an official party. So for a few years, there was an official party of the Green Party. And by the way, I'm not a big fan of the Greens these days, but so there was three parties in Illinois, and they kind of like put the word out through the the liberal and anti-war group community that they were looking for people to run for office in all these different states. And one of the things by being an official party is to run for office, you only had to collect like 550 signatures. But if you didn't have an official party, you had to get thousands if you wanted to run independently. And there were all these rules. It's basically a system that's set up to keep people out from, running as if all you had to do was get a couple hundred signatures.
Anybody could doing it, yeah.
Yeah, you'd have this long list of it. And so there's some logic behind it. But on the Greens, you just had to get. So I absolutely hated my congressman. His name was Dan Lipinski. And he was a Democrat, but he was anti-choice. He was anti-gay. He was just like the most conservative. And he was my congressman, and I hated it. And so when this opportunity presented itself, I was working on the book A Progressive Nation and getting really into my liberal feelings. And I'm thinking, Jerry, you talk a big game. This is an opportunity. One of those things that just kind of like blew through my life. Like, would you like to run for Congress? And I was like, the more I think about it, yeah, I think I could do that. What the heck? I'll give it a shot, So I went and talked to them and got their endorsements. And then we worked with them to get the signatures, and I turned them in, and we weren't challenged. Well, no, that's not true. We were challenged by one guy, and I'll tell you a little story about him. But basically, maybe a week after this all happened, Jim was going to work, and he stopped at a coffee house in town, and he looks at the newspaper that's sitting there, and it says, "Man with sketchy past runs for Green Party nomination." And he's like, does Jerry have a sketchy past,
Breaking into OJ's house. Like
Right, exactly. So he picks up the paper, and it turns out that there was this guy, his name was Richard Mayers, and he was a white supremacist, completely bonkers individual. I mean, he's got problems. Who was who knew that the Green Party had this new status, and so he figured, I'll go out and get five. And he only lived about like 5 blocks from here.
Oh,
he was
so
a Berlin
weird.
resident. Yeah. And so he was running. So here I am. I'm thinking, I'm not going to have any challengers. They could barely get me to do this. And now I'm running against this full-fledged Nazi. And I don't use that term lightly. He was a member of the World Church of the Creator, which were the white supremacist group that killed Richie Birdsong. He was the coach at Northwestern, a basketball coach that was gunned down in the streets. There was somebody that was shot in Bloomington. It was like one of their followers who had done this a number of years earlier. So all of a sudden, I find myself up against this guy that lives right down the street, who is associated with this Nazi cult that, and I, at the time, I was like, Jim, do we really want to do this? But I didn't want to leave and like him be the nominee either.
Right.
Yeah. So the Green people will help me working through this. And, we made sure our locks worked on the house and stuff like that. But then he challenged my right to be on the ballot based on nothing other than just, anybody can challenge anybody's thing. So I got a firsthand knowledge of exactly how people are thrown off the ballot before they even try to get on. You have to turn these things in, but somebody can challenge them. He challenged everybody. He challenged, these were people that were running in the primary. So he challenged Barack Obama, and he challenged Hillary Clinton, and so we had to go to this meeting. He shows up. He's wearing a Confederate soldier's uniform, carrying a big flag, and he's got a disposable camera that he's taking picture of everybody. So I had to go up and sit on the table next to this nut and make my case before the election board. And we knew that it was going to be thrown out because his challenges had to be specific. Like you got fake people signing your signatures. Those signatures aren't valid. He didn't challenge a single one specifically. So we knew we were going to win. But it was sort of frightening because, I'd sit down next to him. He takes out his camera. He's taking pictures of me, and he's just saying all this, awful stuff. And anyway, so the Green Party challenged his signatures and were able to get him kicked off. So I didn't actually have to run against him for the primary. So once he got kicked off, I was going to be winning this thing. But then who do I end up running against? I'm going to... There was another Nazi, a guy by the name of Arthur Jones, and he was Nazi wearing Nazi. He was part of the group that was in the Skokie thing, and he was like this guy that lives on the southwest side of Chicago who every time there was an election, he ran for school board, and he ran for this, and he never won anything, and he's still running today.
Well, and just a sidebar. I mean, everybody is, when Trump got elected, everyone was like, oh, what happened to the country? It's like, clearly this was happening. It was like these guys were around, they were running, there's this undercurrent that we just, maybe some people weren't really paying attention to, but clearly it was there. So, yeah.
And he actually secured the Republican nomination during Trump's presidency. And everybody's like, see what Trump has brought? It's like, Art Jones has been around since the 70s. So,
yep.
People who lived in Chicago knew this, but the national media did not.
Right.
But then after this guy got kicked off, then we would do these candidate forums. And there were several Republicans that were running. And there were like 5 Democrats. And then there was me, the Green Party guy. But one of the Republicans was this Art Jones, and the Republicans didn't want to give him any airtime, so they wouldn't show up to any of the candidates' debates. So every candidate's debate was all the Democrats, Art Jones, crazy man, and me, crazy man, for the Green Party. So Art Jones and I were always like sitting next to each other, like, what did I do in my life that I have to spend this year
rubbing elbows?
Yeah. And one of the other Republicans that ran was a retired circus clown. I kid you not. He was like and he was like the nicest guy. And he only ran because he knew that this Art Jones was running, and he wanted to at least secure the nomination so that Art Jones, and he was, he was not a fan of Art Jones. He had known him for years, and
so a noble fool.
He was a noble fool, yes, but definitely a fool. But yeah, that was a very weird year. Put it that way.
Because I remember when this was happening, and I remember you're Poland for the People bumper sticker on your car for years afterwards. But yeah, a lot of this stuff I don't think I knew at the time. Yeah.
Well, I made it down to the final three, so they had a Republican, a Democrat, and me. And it was one thing that was great because I got to go to all the, the forums. I got to fill out all the forums, like my positions on everything. I went down to WTTW, and they had, and so I got to just rail against my own congressman that I didn't like, and even if I wasn't going to win, I had said my piece, and given people an opportunity to vote for somebody else, a progressive person who had nobody to vote for in this particular district.
Yeah.
And then I will tell you, there is this one caveat to this whole thing, which is I actually won. Because I didn't want him to be my congressman. And years later, and I don't even know if you remember this, but what's his name? He was a Puerto Rican American. He was Luis Gutierrez, a congressman. When they did some redistricting, they moved the boundary, the boundary for the district that I was in with this guy I didn't like was about 3 blocks north of here. And it moved to like 1 block south of here. And somebody who ran for the same office from the Greens also lived just off 31st Street in the next town over, and it moved her out of the district. So we were both like moved into Luis Gutierrez's district. Okay. The boundary lines change all the time. Well, Luis Gutierrez wanted to write a book, and he pitched it to Chicago Review Press. And we said, yeah, we'd be interested in doing this. It was going to be about immigration and, his life and in his work. And we decided he wanted to come in and talk to us and see what we were all about. So we had a meeting with the owner and the publisher, and we all had this meeting. And when we were done, I was walking them to the elevator, and I said, I didn't have a chance to say in this thing, and I think it, just in interest of full disclosure, I once ran for the district that you now represent against what's his name? The Democrat. It was the guy that I didn't like. I don't know why my brain isn't working here, but and he stopped and he turned towards me. He's like, "You're the one." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, when they were redrawing the lines, his people chose. They said, we want this line moved south," and said something to the effect of like, "We had enough of that shit," something like that. So basically, my friend Laurel and I, who had run against him and gone on TV and made fun of him and got moved out of his district. We had been gerrymandered out during this whole process, and he wasn't my congressman anymore. And I ended up with Luis Gutierrez, who I liked, and that
is phenomenal.
Yeah. So it was such a weird thing that and that happened years later, that, just being a thorn in their side through this whole process had allowed me to get rid of my congressman. Now he eventually lost to somebody else, and he's no longer in this thing. But yeah, that was a eye-opening experience, and it was like, oh, okay, so maybe all that work was worth it.
Well, yeah, that's a variation on, as the late great John Lewis would say, good trouble, right? Like, that's good trouble. Yeah. That's good trouble to make for them. Because where are you, like, with your? I mean, would you ever run again, or was it just kind of a one-time thing? Or
that was a tough one. Jim was my campaign manager, and it was tough. Just like managing all this, and I was writing at the same time, and that book came out about the same time, and it was just like not just burning the candle at both ends, but in the middle, and at the end of it all, I was just like, I need to ramp back accepting every single crazy thing that passes my transom, and just focus on the things that that I want. So I'm still very politically interested, whatever, but I don't think I would ever run for office again. And I actually did. I served on the local library board here in Berwyn for, gosh, it was about 10 or 11 years, I think it was. And it's just approving payables for copy machine repair and all this fascinating stuff. But it's the kind of thing that you need in a democracy, people to actually do that kind of work.
And someone who's not nuts to do that work too, yeah.
And it was in an area, it's my love of books, and there was a library, and it was just around the corner. And I was like, oh yeah. And I knew some people on the board. And so I talked to the mayor and said, I'm available if you need anybody. And about a year later, he called me up and said, there's an opening. Would you like to do that? And so anyway, I did that for a while. And, that's more of my political belief right now. It's like people need to get involved on the local level, school boards, library boards, because that's exactly what the conservative side is attacking. And so they need warriors on the other side. And we didn't run into too many problems like that, but we had some efforts at censorship and issues like that we had to address over the number of years that I was there. So
Jerry, what else is next for you? Do you have are you working on a new book, or are you just kind of keeping your head down and doing acquisition stuff at the moment? Or
I'm right now I'm actually just writing a book for myself and my family. I've been real interested in genealogy, and so researching, and I found that my mom's side of the family just goes back in the United States just many years. And in the process, I found a few ancestors that had been in the Civil War, and I thought to myself, I wonder how many of so I'm going to try to identify anybody that was of age to serve during the Civil War that was either my grandfather, my uncle, or my first cousin. So I just narrowed it down to anybody that would fit those categories, and I ended up finding about 200.
Wow.
And I've started this process of contacting the National Archives, getting their service records, and writing a story about each and every one of them. And I put them back on Ancestry. I'm thinking a lot of these guys, their stories are lost. They're in the National Archives. They've got a headstone with a Grand Army of the Republic insignia on it, but who knows what these are? So by putting them on Ancestry, anybody else that finds their ancestry, that would come up as a hint for them, if anybody that works with Ancestry. So they would be able to get to the story that it took me a while to research. So I've been doing this now for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years. It's a great thing to do in front of the TV, because Ancestry is just like searching and looking at documents and stuff like that and assigning them. So that's what I like. I know how to write. I can write a story about each of these guys, and I'm going to share them with people, and I'm not going to make a dime. And so that's what I'm doing. So I'm sort of a way of honoring these ancestors and so many good interesting stories. A couple that died in Andersonville. Actually, one of my great grandfathers, and I don't know why this was never told. He was with the 154th New York Cavalry that escorted Grant to Appomattox Courthouse when he got the surrender from Lee.
Whoa.
And it's like nobody thought in the family to repeat this story down through the years. And when I found that out, I'm like, I got to put this in there, because people have to know he's buried in some cornfield in the middle of Nebraska.
Oh my God.
And this teeny little cemetery that is really surrounded by a cornfield. And I think people should know that. So anyway, that's what I'm doing.
That's amazing. And so I'll put in the show notes all of your books, the ones that we've talked about, all the other ones. I'm sure you've got a robust Amazon page, but because you don't have much of a social media presence or anything online. I was going to say, where can people find you? But they could just find your books, right?
I have no website. I don't Twitterize. I don't Instagrammy and any of that stuff. I mean, I'm also sort of a crank when people say you should have a web page. I'm like, I am not going to have a web page. You should Twitter, you should tweet. And like, I am not going to do that. I'm going to do what I want.
Zines are bust. Yeah. Well,
So-
I will be sure to let people know where they can at least find your books. And so you can make, a couple quarters so that you can buy some more pretzels to enjoy.
I do appreciate that. And
Well-
the current Oddball Illinois, if you got Illinois readers, the current Oddball Illinois is mostly up to date. It's actually fairly new because it's the second edition. So if you're looking for places to see around Illinois, there's a lot of good suggestions in that book.
Awesome. Well, Jerry, this has been such a pleasure just to hear all these stories and talk to you about your process and everything. Because again, you're just the most interesting person with the most insane stories, some of which are not ready for prime time, so we can, we will just allude to the things that you weren't able to say on the air. But
I'm glad I could tell you some stories that you didn't hear in all the lunches that we had together. So
I heard a lot of stories, and I know that there are more still. So yeah. Thank you for being willing to indulge my curiosity.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. This has been wonderful.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of I'll Follow You. Don't forget that you can always find show notes over on my website, queenofpeaches.com. Links to and for previous episodes are listed there as well. While you're there, I hope you might find another episode that strikes your fancy. All my recordings are assembled in my home studio using the free open-source cross-platform editing software Audacity. I use a Logitech G Snowball Ice microphone and Shure SRH 440 professional studio headphones. The theme music is from the song Without You, written by Brian Cremens and performed by the band 1000. This podcast is made possible by the fact that I work a full-time job, am happily married, and don't have any children. That's what really goes on behind the scenes of this artistic life.